Hello and welcome to our webinar today presented by Density and Hassell. Today we're going to be talking about the state of the tech industry's workplaces. We're really excited to get this conversation started. I have a wonderful panel to talk through some of the insights that we found in this report. So today I'm joined by, Daniel Davis, who's the head of research at Hassell. Jose Latorre, who is a leader in space and occupancy strategy at Netflix, and then Phil Kirshner, an expert on workplace, joining us from McKinsey. So before we get into the report and insights, I want to give everyone an opportunity to tell everyone about themselves. So I'll just pass it along to Daniel first to give a quick intro to yourself. Thanks.
Yeah, so I work for Hassell, which is an international design company, and I guess in my research, I'm really focused on workplace research. So got to work a bit with Annie and Phil back in the WeWork days, and yeah, now doing a lot of workplace research at Hassell.
Awesome. Jose?
Thanks, Annie, and thanks for allowing me to participate in the panel. I am part of the team at Netflix that's responsible for managing how we occupy and how we plan our future workspaces. As part of that, I play a role working on developing tools and strategies that support our planners around the world. And as part of that, I think my superpower is to bring in ways to make data useful, insightful, and relevant to our stakeholders. Before that, I was part of the Design Strategies program at Gensler, and had some time working in higher education.
Awesome. Great to have you. And Phil.
Thank you, Annie. Nice to be back with you and Daniel mentioned with our shared WeWork history. I'm Phil Kirshner. I'm a senior expert at McKinsey, and I sit at the intersection of our real estate practice, which is an industry group. So we serve companies in the business of real estate, landlords, owner, operator, investor, prop tech, architecture, design, like you name it, on all kind of manner of topics. And then our people function, so serving largely occupiers on talent and change and diversity and kind of hybrid. So it is the McKinsey version of workplace strategy, a really interesting perspective in getting to lead a lot of our thinking on the future of work and the workplace. But I'm thrilled to be back with our shared history to talk about what you guys are seeing.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, again, great to have all of you on here. Appreciate your time. So I'm Annie. I lead analytics and insights at Density. And as Daniel and Phil mentioned, we all overlapped and worked together at WeWork in the past. So we're excited to be back together. But yeah, so at Density, we have a fascinating data set. We have a super high resolution understanding of space utilization and behavior in the workplace. And Daniel and I thought that it would be awesome to have Hassell, a global leader in design, and Density come together on this research to share Hassell's and Daniel's, understanding of workplace and brain for research, and Density's really rich data and understanding of the workplace. And so this report was formed as a partnership, and the research has been part of that, and it's been really fun to get to work together on it. So getting into the research we did together, this report covers about 1.4 million square feet of workplaces in North America. So we have a lot of offices on the West Coast in the report and East Coast. These are all technology customers, customers of Density who are in the technology sector. So really focusing on tech. And as part of this, we analyzed 61 floor plans. Again, a really amazing opportunity to compare and contrast and understand how space looks across all of these workplaces. The report includes a year of data, so it's May 2023 to May 2024, and we're generally looking at utilization, how much and how often these spaces are used. So I want to get into some of the top insights that came through in the research. The first is really about underuse. And so Based on the analysis, we see that over $40 million is spent every year on tech workplaces that are underused. You can see on the left, overall utilization for the workplaces in this analysis was at 34%. This varies then across meeting rooms, workstations, and the different types of collaborative spaces, meeting rooms having the highest use. So just kind of starting out there, I'd love, Daniel, maybe for you to weigh in on this is I work with this data a lot. My team works with this data at Density, but what are your thoughts on where we're at in terms of utilization?
Yeah, I mean, it still surprises me to see these stats so low. And I think especially in America, it's a lot lower than we see elsewhere. But I think what for me was really curious about this data is that, I don't know, you've seen like the reports and they have like swipe badge data of how many people are coming to buildings and stuff, but actually seeing that in some parts of these offices, things like the meeting rooms, even though the utilization might be quite low, like that at capacity in many of these offices, or they're oversaturated. And then in these other spaces, just really, really quiet. And yeah, I think there's big implications, not just of costs, but also the environmental impact of having a bunch of space getting cooled or heated that is not really being utilized. And then also I think it's just like not a great feeling to come into an office and just not have a bunch of people around you, like it's a little bit sad. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Jose, is this kind of emphasis on meeting rooms, is that what you're seeing at Netflix? That the majority of time spent is in those spaces?
Yeah, so I'm fortunate to have been part of Netflix before the pandemic, so I have a point of reference. We've always been a very collaborative culture. So I almost think like the best work is done when we're in the same place, sharing ideas. We tended to lean very heavily on meeting spaces when we planned offices. We do that even more nowadays. We find that collaboration is the biggest driver for employees to come into the office when we do our research. So it remains a big priority for us. I think we live on data a lot, all of us in the panel. So there's part of this that leans on average peak, kind of telling part of the story. What we've done lately is to start looking at not only averages, but also starting to do some education around percentiles, so that we can show some of the variance, right? Because for us, if we only look at the average, it will tell a limited story. So we don't necessarily see lower averages as bad news, as long as we have those peaks that show that our offices are being well utilized when they're needed.
Yeah, and I think we all know well that utilization doesn't tell the whole story. There's it's that variability, the days when people are in office, depending on your policy, or not in the office, that is the challenge, or maybe also the opportunity, right, of the kind of where we're at now in how we work. So let's get into a little bit more of the insights. I'd love to come back to generally, like the underused space and what we do about it. But I think it's interesting to see a little bit more detail on how different types of companies are working and when. So one of the things we did in the report as well was looked at the relationship between utilization and policy. And so of the companies that were included in the report, we broke them out by their specific hybrid policy. And here we're showing a comparison of 3-day in a week policy, 2-day a week policy, and employee decides. There is a difference, you see. 3-day a week policy companies had higher, again, this is an average, it's not showing those highs and lows, higher utilization overall, but it wasn't as high as we'd expect. I'm curious, Phil, thinking about, sort of in the customers that the clients you've worked with, is this consistent with the stories that you're hearing from technology workplaces?
Yeah, broadly speaking, I think like when asked about different firms and their hybrid policies, either clients directly or teams working with clients will say, where's the battleground in terms of days? And I'll say it's really between 2 and 3. Most employees, given a choice, full autonomy, and obviously like taking out the fully remote companies. So like companies that still have offices and are hybrid in some way, people who live within a commutable distance, like 2 days is not a big ask. And it very much aligns with the demand for flexibility that I saw with clients and even as a practitioner prior to COVID, where people, probably worked a half a day or a day remotely around the margins, but it just wasn't really systemically understood or approved. And all they really wanted then was like an extra day-ish. So that gets you to this kind of like, oh yeah, 2 days for sure, 3 days like most of the time. So now I'll say like, they'll give you 2 without very much pressure at all. Question is, if you want 3, you have to earn 3, and 4 is kind of a non-starter. So in addition to the difference between the 3 and 2 day here not being that much, maybe only 10%, the fact that a 2-day a week policy and an employee deciding is very close supports that to me, right? Like if I live within the commutable distance and it's a reasonable place to work with people that I like, I'll go 2 days. It's like, that's not a big ask. But if you want 3, it's got to be worth it to me. It has to be give me like a return on that commute in a way that many offices still struggle with.
Yeah, I agree that the kind of the lower end of this is almost like maybe what's more interesting. That's sort of like, is there that big difference between enforcing a policy versus allowing your employees to choose what works best for them? Yeah. Anything else on this specific insight from the group?
One other thing just to note here was that all the companies we studied, none of them had a policy requiring people to be back either 4 days or 5 days. Like all these companies had moved to a place where they were either fully remote or in these kind of hybrid variations or flavors of hybrid that they're trying out, which I think, it is a really big departure from what's been there before.
Yeah, my other question maybe about this is 3 days 2 and 2 days 1? Is 3, like what is the we've looked a lot at in more detail about like kind of the shape of the day for different companies and the duration in office kind of, and quality is what is most important, right? The kind of the quality time spent together and that it's the right time with the right people. But it's not surprising that, I bet if we were to look in a little bit more detail that we would see that this 3-day, are in a 3-day policy, are you matching that? It's probably even a little bit lower, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I would say just to add, regardless of policy, one interesting area to look at is that how are those peak daily utilization numbers spiking across weeks? Going back to the comment before around whether you're making good use of your real estate, that may be your average peak, but there's days that you'll go beyond that. And so how consistent is that happening? And that's definitely something that will challenge planning moving forward.
Yeah, and that's one thing that Daniel looked at specifically. It's included in the report, kind of how often different offices are getting to those peak levels. Peak and kind of the variation between the days. And so definitely something to look at. We haven't included it here, but that's in there. And it varies for sure.
That, Annie, like from a policy perspective, I know we're focusing on technology companies. When you say like if you ask for 3, are you really getting 2? For almost every other kind of company, financial services, healthcare, life sciences, like who have large technologist workforces, the people who are probably more like most of the employees of the company that you study, the sort of where we do hear mandates, oh, you've got to be here 3 days or 4 days. The footnote is like, oh, well, unless you're like in software development, in which case we're a little more sensitive to demands for flexibility and a little less likely to apply that same pressure. So that aligns a bit with this too, even those larger tech workforces outside of tech companies.
Yeah, and that I think is a real challenge, right? Because the work that the that's done by software engineers is really important to these companies. And we want to make sure that those, that population has what they need to get their work done, right? So it's definitely something we talk a lot about with our customers, trying to make sure to accommodate all the different work styles, and that like heads down, like I'm coding all day work style being very dominant in terms of how these spaces are planned. What about outside of tech? So you mentioned it a little bit, Phil, but what about outside of tech? Do you think that the policy is making it, do you think that this is the same, or is that something you've looked at other research, or is it different in tech?
It's the same. I'd still say the battleground is between 2 and 3, by and large. You will find more people pushing for 3 or 4, if not fully back in the office in like real deal financial services and banking. That doesn't mean they all succeed, but the desire for it is stronger there. But again, they will caveat for tech workforces.
Within those,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which again, as you said, is hard to generalize at the industry level. And you really have to go down to work patterns and the realities of not just what that company wants, but how flexible are the roles that are available in that category of job across industries. It's harder to do certain things remotely, but software development, not remote, isn't for everybody, but there are more available jobs in that category, like than almost any other, if someone wants it. So you push someone too hard, the pond in which they're fishing for another opportunity could be literally anywhere. It's not someone else's office down the street.
Yeah, very interesting to think, right, that's the most remote, like you can do that job remote, right?
Which doesn't make it easy, but you can.
So tech is in an interesting space, I think. I think we've always thought of tech as leaders in terms of the future of work and how workplaces are designed, but it's a little bit of a different population than some of the other industries. Let's get into kind of what's happening when people get into the office. So we touched on this a little bit before. Looking at when people are in the office, we're actually seeing that when we break this down by policy, that the employees that have the most flexibility on their policy, so they're not required 2 days or 3 days, are actually spending twice as much time in meeting spaces. Daniel, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this specific insight coming out of the research.
Yeah, I feel like this one's actually really critical. Like in some ways, it's obvious that you change the policy and it changes how many times someone comes into an office. Like that's really straightforward. But changing the policy and actually seeing that also changes what the person does when they come to the office or why they're coming into the office. That's also equally critical. And I think it's critical when you're thinking about designing these spaces, right? Like if people are choosing to come in and they're choosing to come in more for meetings, even like then like half the time they're spending in meetings, half the time they're spending outside of meetings. So they're still doing a lot of focused work or spending time at desks. But it means that like the mix of spaces potentially has to change, and that depending on, although these policies all seem on the surface maybe like kind of similar to one another, even these like slight differences like are causing these differences, not just in how many times someone's coming into the office, but what they're doing when they're there. And I think that's something really, really key to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I think this is obviously a really big difference we saw here in the workplaces that we looked at. And I'm curious to, we talk a lot about this at Density, is how much of this time is time spent in on Zoom calls and a solo meeting, like one person in a room, but also we know that that's important time as well, right? And so I think it demonstrates that there is there's something a little bit different happening with this population, and maybe more collaboration is happening, but definitely a lot of time in rooms, and thinking about whether or not our workplaces accommodate that is probably the most important thing for us to do. I think what we have next, yes. So this is a good kind of lead into this. Daniel, I'll let you explain this figure. I think it's really important for us to kind of compare the design of spaces to how they're actually being used, and this figure sort of summarizes it.
Yes, this graph is a little bit complex, but that's why I like it.
Let's walk through it. Yeah.
Yeah, so the vertical axis there, the y-axis, is showing the proportion of space and on average that these floor plans have. So you see that open plan seating, on average, it accounts for about 39% of the overall square footage of these offices that we've been looking at. And then the x-axis there, the horizontal one, is the overall like utilization of these spaces. Basically, what this graph is saying is that, like, think of something like open plan seating. We've dedicated a lot of space in these offices to that area, but it's not a particularly well utilized space. Meeting rooms in comparison occupy a fairly small proportion of that floor plan, but have this disproportionate amount of utilization, really heavily utilized. And I think it's just an interesting diagram to think about, like, whether we're allocating space correctly. I think particularly tech companies, compared to maybe some of these other industries pre-pandemic, I think we're really on the vanguard and really like not out on a limb, but out in front in terms of adopting open plan offices, really pushing for amenities and in-person collaboration and those types of spaces. And in some ways, maybe that hasn't served them quite as well in this transition, where other offices that maybe like financial companies that have more, say, enclosed spaces might be faring a little bit better through that. Yeah.
Yeah, Jose, I'm interested at Netflix and kind of how your workplace has evolved over the last 6-7 years. You've been there long enough to see it through kind of all these changes and how we work. Where does your workplace fall on this now, and kind of where are you headed at Netflix in terms of how you allocate to these different programs?
Yeah, I love the chart, for the record, Daniel, but I think for us, we've gone through different iterations of how we program spaces through time. I would say this is more similar to what we call our legacy spaces would look like, in which there was a higher emphasis on assigned seating, right? Making sure that everyone got a seat. And that led to a lot of space dedicated to open plan seating. We've found that by leveraging data like this, attendance data, different type of data, we are able to challenge those assumptions a little bit and allow for more space to be dedicated for collaboration, whether that's enclosed or informal, right? But making sure that what we call we space is more of that pie chart or that bar chart that you're showing compared to the individual me space. So we're definitely kind of fighting that fight, right, to make sure that everyone understands the why. It's an important piece, right, so that employees and stakeholders understand why we lean towards that and what are the trade-offs. But yeah, that's kind of like where we're at, and I see that pattern kind of moving towards the future for sure.
Mm-hmm. Is your open plan seating used, like what you do have of it?
Yeah, so it varies, right? As I said before, I think the ebbs and flows of the peaks can change a lot. It also varies a lot by team. So I think one thing we've learned over time is that there's not a one size fits all, right? So there might be pockets of the open seat planning that have higher peaks than the other side of the open seat planning, and we should recognize that and adapt that. One thing that we've started looking at is less of the overall daily peak and more looking at, your totally unused seats during the day, right? So this is a low figure, but once you get into like the 30s or 40s, we're more interested to see like what seat or how many seats were not used at all during the day, because there's patterns of behavior, right? People may use the desk as kind of like that coat rack or that locker. And we are more interested to know, like, are we leaving space completely unused during the day? And then if so, start addressing that. So that's our latest thinking now.
Yeah, it's a really wonderful thing that we we are able to do for our customers as well is kind of look desk by desk. And again, it's like totally anonymous, but just getting an understanding of like this desk wasn't touched, like no one was here at all. It's been, I think, really valuable information for our customers to make decisions. So one of the things, the points that you made, Daniel, was that, or actually kind of Jose made it as well, is that, and this is talked about a lot in the report, is that a lot of these offices were designed right before the pandemic, before things shifted again, like as, you know, and the sort of the best of the best, right? And that hasn't really caught up. The designs of these workplaces has not caught up to how we're using the space today. I'm curious from Phil, great to have you on here. So there are design and construction changes that we can make. We know, right? We can spend more money, redesign these, try to catch up. But kind of what's the first step like before that, or what can companies do to try to better fit their workplaces to their spaces? Maybe as they're figuring out what like to improve the experience before, they renovate completely and redesign the floor.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, and I say often, like, I'm as guilty of this as anybody who had anything to do with design projects prior to COVID. It seems maybe simple, but like, it's simple to say, hard to do, is like really defining a purpose of why you have an office to begin with. Like, what is that place supposed to do? And it can't do everything. And the problem that most offices face, and certainly I saw this as a practitioner years ago, like, you can't please everybody all the time. Everyone's patterns are different. And if you try to solve every work pattern for every person, like all of them will get kind of like a B minus grade, instead of picking the 3-5 things that you want your office to be exceptional at, and making sure that they are a clear A, so that you can still welcome employees for other reasons. Like, even this is maybe a client center, it's more collaborative, but like if you live in a house that you share with other people and struggle to focus there, like please come. We want you here all the time.
Right.
But because it is not priority one, I will make sure that you have ample space to sit. I will not necessarily concern myself that you cannot at all times sit within 5 feet of exactly the other human that you want to sit next to, because the primary purpose of this particular place is something that's maybe more group oriented. So creating that purpose at the top of the house for a portfolio and then individual sites allows you to sort of put a sign on the door for what a building is or isn't good at. And then at the tail end, instead of just post-occupancy studies in the traditional sense of like asking employees what they think, really almost imagining that you can sit down and have like a performance review with your building. Like, you're supposed to be doing this. And maybe it's like a driving apprenticeship. And if the answer is like, you're not doing it very well, maybe design contributes to some of that, but more likely it is something about how the space is activated or the culture and leadership skills around it, right? You could have like fabulous lunch and learns happening every day, but for some reason the managers like don't let their employees go. Therefore, they're not learning anything. It's not about having the space for the lunch, it's not about having the program. I think we all experience this certainly we work in our like highest occupancy period of like, yeah, these certain offices, our headquarters in particular, right? Amazing for problem solving and growth and sales, are like not great for focus. So we could also say like, if you want that, we'll support it as best we can, but you can also go somewhere else, including but not limited to your home or another WeWork or anywhere else in the world. Like, so that's really like an eye-opening experience for a lot of clients, like that they haven't defined a purpose, which then informs the design and also the activation, but all the other leadership and like cultural qualities that go into making sure it is successful in doing what it's supposed to do.
Yeah, and like, so understanding like what the expectations are and making sure they're clear and like setting those and then, but also being like, are we matching them? Like, is this a space where people can come and get focus work done? Or is this a space, where I can collaborate and I'm seeing the right people? We've talked some about, activity in a space, and you mentioned kind of like how busy it was at WeWork during those the busiest times, and you'd say there's no way you could get work done in here. But it's actually interesting because sometimes you would choose that place or choose that specific floor. I was thinking sometimes I would choose a place where I knew no one because I would get more done. I wasn't going to be, so like having the flexibility to be like, I don't want to be near my coworkers because I need heads down work, but I want activity and the liveliness, right? Like just having the set of choices, I think is really important.
Yeah, and the vibrancy point, like one thing that jumps off the page, this chart for me, like I would usually, it's the circulation, right? So tech offices by and large are generous, right? Because of amenity space and informal space. Certainly WeWorks or other flex offices have maybe not generous enough in terms of efficiency sometimes. But if you strip that out, what you see is basically 2/3 of the space planned for individuals like me, my desk, my office, 1/3 for us. But a number of companies, even in the technology space, who have gone public with like, hey, here's our redesign, they're basically flipping the ratio. They're cutting the individual space in half, which then means it's sort of like 2/3 for us and 1/3 for me. And I do believe that is like the direction of travel that leans into what people are self-selecting when they're coming in on their own choice. But the circulation sort of matters in that too, right? There's a level of inefficiency that comes from over amenitized spaces. And now a lot of firms are facing that challenge of solving for not losing the experience they've always had, but introducing efficiency in the midst of new ways of working.
Daniel, how are you thinking about this at Hassell in terms of like defining purpose? I thought that was a really good point made by Phil. And also if you don't have that campus or portfolio or nearby buildings, and I think Jose, I'm sure you have some insight on this as well. How can we better define what our buildings or workplaces need to do how are we doing that?
Yeah, maybe like I think Phil's point about purpose is really key. And I think one part of this has been maybe like a kind of disconnect happening between, say, facilities and HR and leadership, where it's been perhaps easy to make some of these changes, not easy, but less difficult to make some of these changes to policy. And these changes to like buildings and space is like really hard. It's going to take years. The lease cycles are super long. So it can't be done like overnight. And I think having those parts of the business in alignment and an agreement about what the actual goal of these things are is really key as well. Because without that, you sort of, maybe having one group deciding, hey, this is going to be our workplace policy, it makes everyone happy. But then facilities people are trying to catch up and being like, hey, this like completely changes how everyone's using this space and everything's no longer kind of fit for purpose.
Yeah, I think it comes down to will many times, right? So yes, real estate cycles are slow and construction takes time, but there's instances in which if the stars align, right, you'll get the right kind of leadership support, the right kind of operational support, and then if on top of that you have the data behind it to make informed decisions, then you can start doing things without necessarily having to, get out of the lease or go build things out. We've had instances of that when there's a desire to create more buzz in the office, especially earlier on when, attendance was lower, right off the pandemic type of thing, in which we said, let's close down a floor for a while and bring people together, closer together. And we had data to show that there was enough space, there was enough meeting rooms, so why not? Let's go and do it. And it created the buzz that the people in that site needed and led to better buzz and more attendance. So there are low-hanging fruits, but I think the right supporting data has to be there. And then I think, Daniel, to your point, the right stakeholder support has to be there too.
Yeah, I love that though, like working with what you have, right? Like hibernating a floor and then proving out the hypothesis, right? So saying, what if we did this? Let's simulate it. And then it probably helped you make future decisions or get the buy-in to make bigger changes, right? And design, to increase your kind of desk sharing ratio or to prove that actually, more people in the space done thoughtfully is a better experience. So
yeah, for sure.
We're big on experimentation over here. So that's awesome to hear. Okay, so I think one of the last insights that we wanted to share was looking at meeting rooms and offices. How much, I mentioned before that we know that a lot of people are, on Zoom calls. We're way more distributed and virtual than probably the time when many of these offices are designed. And so on the right, you see the proportion of time that meeting rooms were occupied by one person versus on the left, or versus multiple people in the lighter green. And then on the left, looking at private offices, how that's split between one person, so solo usage, and almost evenly also serving as a space for multiple people. And so we're seeing that private offices and meeting rooms have kind of double lives, I guess. Daniel, do you want to share a little bit about this insight?
Yeah, I mean, I think this one's quite interesting too, because like we're seeing that the meeting rooms are obviously heavily utilized, and you initially think, oh, like meeting rooms are heavily utilized. There's a whole bunch of people in there having meetings, talking to one another. And when you look at the data, it's like a third of the time it's actually a single person in there, either on a phone call or camped out using it as an office. And I think you could look at that and say, like, maybe it's a problem, but I think you can also look at that and say, like, these people are signaling something through their choice of where they're working. And they're really kind of saying that, hey, I don't have a space that's private. I don't have a space that has the right acoustic quality. I don't have a space where I can sit and do focused work. And I feel like that might be an indication that some of these spaces are either lacking in these offices or they're not in enough abundance that people have access to them.
And then what about private offices? Is this how it always was, or are we seeing new behavior in private offices? I mean, I know we only looked at this past year, but maybe Phil, from your experience kind of over the years in workplace, do we think the private office is changing, or is it just what it has always been?
Yeah, I mean, certainly we've been on a multi-year trend to like have fewer of them and make them smaller. So they don't now have typically the 6-person table in addition to the private office table. And in like traditional utilization studies, walk around studies, like for years, almost any industry, it's usually the people who are in the private office, who have private offices, who are around less, right? Because they are in meetings somewhere else more. So the overall utilization like lower, and now like thankfully we've been seeing through design like more and more people. I'm physically standing in a room that like at quick glance could be an office, but like could very easily be a small team space, and that's becoming more common. So like how you label it, it's still like from a takeoff looking at the plane, be like, oh, it's an office, but in reality, how it's occupied may very well be like a flexible space. So why I think we see kind of the multiple people in private offices. And then what this also says to me, particularly outside of tech, I think you probably would see the one-person use of a large room even higher traditionally, because there was nothing between the private office and the enormous room. The recommendation is always like you have too few spaces that are built for 2 or 3 or 4 people. It's like 1 or 20. And you need more diversity in the middle. Like you're always going to have, as Daniel said, a bit of the single occupancy, which could be for many reasons. And now like there's been an absolute explosion of things you could call booths, like coming into workplaces, and tech has been leading that. You're much more likely to see these like, furniture element booths, I think, in a tech workplace still than you are in financial services and life science and like public sector, all these other industries. But yeah, like I kind of hope we get to a world where there isn't really like private office. It's like, yeah, small space for a small number of people, even smaller for like solo use, and then just true diversity and sizing and availability and tech support for collaborative space, enabled by the fact that there is like twice as much of this stuff in a given office now as there was before in total.
One thing I worry about with like the booth explosion is that we'll get back to and also sometimes when we're building recommendations off of looking at behavior at density, is that there is such a need for these enclosed solo spaces, right? And so like kind of understanding the difference between providing that and a sea of private offices is like a really important thing for us to figure out, right? Like that we don't need to just put up walls, right? It's kind of, it feels like we're going back to a little bit like, well, if I just had a cubicle, maybe I could get my work done. Right?
Yeah, and the key is that they're all modular, right? Like I tell clients, like just explore, like you can buy one.
Yeah.
If it doesn't work, like you can
Right.
move it. And
Yeah.
it's not the same as like building a wall. And just wanting like supreme flexibility no matter what you do is the name of the game, which is why again it's really hard sometimes to do that in your own space. And it's oftentimes easier. So like as your needs change, I just direct you to some other place that was built differently from the start, even though that space may not be mine. Right, with an eye on flex, because like
Yeah.
it is too expensive to just constantly be turning over the same space. But if you build diversity, you can send people to where they should go as their needs change, as opposed to assuming that they're static.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised by the private office stat, right? I think if we go back to the earlier slides and we think about purpose as part of why people come into the office, and you think of the people that occupy a private office, they're probably having their team also be in the office when they're in. And so the fact that they're collaborating so much in those spaces makes sense. I think if you had the layer of the observational study, right, Phil, added here, you'd probably see that 52%, like half of that time is also spent on a BC, right? So it's actually also collaboration within the office. So it's good use of space for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And again, the quality of the work you're getting done. And also the missing component here is like whether or not collaboration is happening virtually, right? And it's a space meeting that need. Okay, so we're going to move to a question and answer section. We have a little bit more time. I'm gonna just look at the panel here. Okay, so I just wanted to wrap up on a few things we're interested in getting the panel's perspective on. So I'm curious in thinking about the changes that we can make, Jose. When you do make changes to your workplaces, how does Netflix handle change management? And what has worked well and what hasn't?
Good question. We handle it case by case, I would say, right? Like if you read our culture memo, where people over process, project over process, I'd say then in that case, I think when Phil touched a little bit on it, when it's worked better, it's when we found organic opportunities for change management versus this like, welcome to the lunch and learn. That's about how to behave in the workplace, right? And it's more like, can we integrate components of workplace change management into onboarding, right? And be consistent around that. Can we do it in the town halls about the upcoming project, right? And make it part of it and not so much a strict, like you must attend for this. Also simplicity, it's a key thing. And one of the things that I would say from learnings is just recognizes that one size does not fit all, right? So it is often that language can be created around change management that just assumes that we all work the same way and have the same behaviors, and just acknowledging that there needs to be flexibility in the messaging that you're trying to get through so that it really resonates and it lands well.
I love not having another lunch and learn to learn how to use the office, right? Like that's, yeah, I think making it simple, incorporating it kind of into like, you think about like habit forming and how to make things easily, make easy shifts, like small shifts in what you do every day already, right? So Daniel, question for you. So we know that offices are not, and we talked about this, they're not fully optimized for hybrid working, how we're working today. And we know renovations are expensive. We talked to this a little bit before, but like, what are other so in changing behavior, a little bit Jose touched on, but what are some of the quick wins that we could recommend for workplaces to adapt right now?
Yeah, so I don't think there's like necessarily like a one size fits all solution that like every company should be implementing, but there are some, and we've touched on them a little bit, but like yeah, installing booths like super easy, super fast. Looking at converting private office space potentially, looking at like tweaking policies. And then I think beyond that, just thinking about maybe you can't make the capital expenditure now, you don't have the political kind of power to do that right now. There's still like moves that you can be making as an organization to set yourself up for success in the future. And again, we've touched on some of these, but like I think running pilots, testing things out, making sure that you have the data in place that like when it comes time to actually making that change, you're not making it from a whole bunch of assumptions. You've actually gone through this period of testing things out, building consensus, and you're in a really well-informed place and know the direction that you want to go. And maybe back to Phil's point about purpose, you know the purpose that you're trying to achieve with that space when you do come to make it.
Yeah, and like what is success, right? And what, and yeah, what you're trying to do. I also think like staying really close to it, right? So like monitoring as you make, so testing, obviously, which testing and experimenting, but then once you do make a big change, like making sure you're getting feedback, you're watching how it's going, you're kind of adjusting things as it goes. It's fascinating to see how behavior change. We look at like again solo meeting room usage and how often people use conference rooms by themselves, right? But like how does that change when you have got twice as many people in the office? And so yeah, I think there can be some unexpected trends or behaviors that result as changes are made. So just keeping an eye on them, working really closely with the team is important. Okay, so we're almost out of time, but I did want to ask Phil one question. This is a kind of a nice big one to end on. So we've showed you some data points today, looking at utilization a lot. And we talked about the highs and lows and maybe like how that metric is not as useful. What metrics are the most valuable? Like, what are your clients, like what's actually working in terms of measurement for your clients? What metrics are most valuable?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Hard question.
The trick is instead of studying, like trying to figure out like how effective is the workplace, which, if you try to really think about effectiveness, right? So there's like efficiency, which is usually, is there less of it? Like we only using what we should. And then there's experience, like, does it make me feel amazing? Effectiveness is the category in the middle. Like, is it doing what it's supposed to do and just not making my day worse? You can look at like failure rates and tickets and that stuff, but I think the goal, once you've defined a purpose, is like, can you measure that purpose, that outcome, completely independent of place? And then figure out, are the people who are moving through, like occupying certain spaces, having different outcomes on that measure, right? So we talk about like, I want to use instead of saying I want the office for connection and community, the sort of McKinsey version would say like, you should be managing social capital in a way that you manage other forms of capital. You could look at social network dynamics, like how many people in your organization do you interact with? Are you in meetings with? Like all that data is very much available digitally. So clients who say like, oh, I want people to come in for community, I'll ask like, do you measure things like social capital and network analysis like at all? And if the answer is no, like you should sort of go back to the drawing board on that first. Make sure, can you tell the difference between like Bill's network scope and Annie and Jose and Daniel? Like, can you do that at an individual level? And then if you can prove that like Annie goes into the office more and her network magic is better, whatever that number is for you, then like it's doing something about her being there is affecting her kind of community glue with the rest of the company. And you should figure out why that is and lean into it. And if you can show that correlates to better performance or promotability or business outcomes, like then you tell employees, do what you want, but I guarantee you, if you come in more, this will boost your social capital, which will have all these other beneficial knock-on effects. As opposed to just like asking someone, could you focus today? Right? Like that's not, we don't like to be surveyed that way anymore. But you got to define the purpose and then have the review with the office to say like, are you moving the number in a way that just being by myself at home doesn't move whatever that number is?
Network magic.
Network magic. Yeah.
No, and it's a difficult thing to measure, but very important. And it's different from sentiment too. I think like sentiment is important, kind of qualitative feedback is important, but there are other quantitative signals that we
Yes.
could use to associate with patterns that are, good patterns in the office. And so I think that's definitely the direction we should be moving. So we're just out of time. So I want to just, any closing thoughts from the group? Anything we missed?
No, it's exciting.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the conversation. Again, it was really fun for Daniel and I to get to work on this project together, and we're looking forward to continuing to learn together. And I hope that everyone can check out the report. If you didn't, we'll make sure to share the link in the notes for the webinar. And yeah, hope everyone has a wonderful day. And thank you again. Good to see you guys.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.